Did you ever think there might be a fault line passing underneath your living room? A place in which your life is lived in meeting and separating, wondering and telling, unaware that just beneath you is the unseen seam of great plates that strain through time, and that your life, already spilling over the brim, could be invaded, set off in a new direction, turned aside by forces that you're warned about but not prepared for. Shelves could be spilled out, the level floor set at an angle in some seconds shaking. You would have to take your losses, do whatever must be done next. When the great plates slip and the earth shivers, and the flaw is seen to lie in what you trusted most, look not to more solidity, to weighty slabs of concrete poured, or strength of cantilevered beam to save the fractured order. Trust more the tensile strands of love that bend and stretch to hold you in the web of life that's often torn, but always healing. There's your strength. The shifting plates, the restive earth, your room, your precious life, they all proceed from love, the ground on which we walk together. Last night at sundown, the 7-day-long Jewish festival of Passover came to an end. During those days, Seders are held, as I understand you held one here on Wednesday night. These Seders are a retelling of the part of the book of Exodus from the Torah, of the Israelites enslaved in Egypt, of a reluctant leader who, called by God, leads his people into freedom. I am the child of a Jewish mother and a Methodist father who married in a Unitarian Universalist church. Of all of the myriad of religious holidays that I can choose from, Passover was always one of my favorites. As with many holidays, the food is very important. The sweet, nutty flavors of the apple and the walnut haroset, a reminder of the mortar that the slaves used to build Pharaoh's temples. The green harbinger of spring, parsley, dipped in salt water, reminding us that life is always woven with sorrow and tears. And the intense horseradish, a taste of the bitterness that the slaves endured. As a child, I would serve myself the smallest atom of horseradish possible. And I gaped at the grown-ups with these big spoonfuls that they took. How could they endure that much bitterness? And the story. What to make of this story? The 10 plagues suffered by the Egyptians as punishment for not letting the Israelites be free. They are something out of a modern zombie film. The Nile River turns to blood. All the dust in Egypt turns into lice. And then there's that incredible last-minute escape with Pharaoh's army in hot pursuit. Will they make it? Yes. Yes. Miraculously, they make it to the other side of the Red Sea, those who were enslaved on their way to freedom. Part of the appeal of these Seders and why they live in my memory so powerfully is because all of the people around that table were in religiously mixed families. One parent was Jewish, one parent wasn't. And this was in rural New Hampshire in the 1970s, when almost 100% of the population was white and certainly Protestant or Catholic. Those Seders and the retelling of the story of survival and identity in a place where our families were unusual helped us remember part of who we were and reminded us that we were part of something larger. It's also probably not surprising to you that the majority of the families around that table were also members of their local Unitarian Universalist congregation. In my childhood memory, the story ends there with that cinematic parting of the Red Sea and the great relief of freedom. But really, this is only the beginning. After Moses leads the Israelites through the Red Sea, after Miriam, his older sister, who saved his life at birth, after she takes up the musical instruments and leads the spontaneous and joyous music, things get challenging. Freedom means the wilderness. Freedom means the unexpected, the unanticipated, the unknown. Freedom means the wilderness. And when the people who have escaped slavery and death, when they get into this hard, unfamiliar territory, some of them begin to grumble. The text says that they start to murmur against Moses. Isn't that a wonderful word? What are we going to drink? I may have died in Egypt, but at least I wasn't thirsty. And after another hard day of journeying, the people start to murmur against Moses and other leaders. We would rather have died in Egypt, where at least we had food, than be brought out here in the wilderness and all of us die of hunger. These stories are ancient, but really, could the feelings behind these words sound any more contemporary? The people are afraid. They've left what they know. They've left their homes. They've left their sources of water, their sources of food. And even the bondage, as terrible as it was a known entity. They're being asked to trust their leaders. They're being asked to trust a God they're not yet sure of. And I don't know what you would do, but I know that when I am afraid, a little off-center, not very grounded, it is a struggle to bring my most faithful self to that moment. It's a struggle to bring my most grounded self to that moment. And I cannot help but imagine that at some point someone asked Moses with a certain degree of anxiety, "Are we there yet?" The story tells us that the Israelites journeyed for 40 years in the wilderness, seeking the promised land. Moses and the original leaders, the original people, never saw it. The search didn't end until a new generation had been raised up in freedom, not knowing bondage, either its pain or its familiarity. "20 years ago this September, I journeyed to this place to serve as your intern minister. And one of the early and warm welcomes I received was from Beverly Scaff. Yeah. Yes. an early church member and the author of this congregation's origin story. The story of a handful of families in the 1950s yearning for something more in their lives. And I don't think it's too dramatic to name it as a yearning for freedom. Freedom from the bondage of orthodoxy, freedom from religious literalism. And it's vital to remember their context. The dropping of the atomic bomb and the end of World War II was only 6 years earlier. The horror of the Holocaust was still being revealed. I think of that small group of families in a time of great social and political and religious upheaval. And I imagine that they yearned for a religious community where they could wrestle with what it meant to live an ethical and moral life. That they could wrestle with how to understand God in the midst of such incredible human evil. The late Unitarian Universalist minister Forrest Church offers, religion is the human response to the dual reality of being alive and having to die. Religion is the human response to the dual reality of being alive and having to die. How do we make meaning of our lives in this world that has such beauty, such joy, such wonder, and such bitterness, and such sorrow? How do we understand and comprehend the spirit of life amidst war and destruction? How do we participate in creating a world we want to see? Freedom means the wilderness. And I imagine that there were times that that small band of families who chartered this congregation in 1951 felt that they were in the wilderness. They were not always sure that the community would survive. And there were, like with the Israelites, varying opinions about leadership. They were certainly nomadic, moving from individual homes to a little house on Pine Street, to the Women's Center in Walnut Creek and the Red Cross building. Journeying and growing in numbers, because it turns out there were other people in this valley who yearned for a new way to engage these questions of meaning. There were others who yearned for a liberal religious education for their children, who yearned to feel themselves a part of something bigger than themselves. And while we would barely recognize their services in 1951, 60 years ago, we would recognize the impulse. We would recognize the questions they were asking. And finally, this band of seekers and meaning makers planted roots here at the foot of Mount Diablo. Here, where millions of years ago, shifting tectonic plates birthed this mountain. Here, where thousands of children and women and men have claimed and lived out their Unitarian Universalist faith. 20 years ago, I came to live and minister among you. You had a very solid reputation as a teaching congregation. And Dave Salmons had a very strong reputation as an intern supervisor. This sanctuary did not exist. We worshiped across the courtyard in the multi-purpose room that was in fact serving multi-purposes, now known as the Gilmartin Building. And back then, Dave and lay leaders had a vision of a new sanctuary. And I recall being in meetings where there were members that were opposed to the idea. They were afraid of the cost. They were afraid that the congregation might grow too big. They were afraid of the change. And not unlike the Israelites in the desert, there were questions. Aren't we there now? Do we have to keep going? But you remain committed to the journey. You and your leadership were patient. You held up a vision of who you could be, and you created it. Here we are. 20 years ago, you helped raise up a minister. You were generous with me as I learned to create worship. You told me what you needed when I didn't or couldn't know. You told me when I'd hurt your feelings or when you disagreed with me. We found our way forward. The Elder Journey Group generously shared their lives with me. And this is the hard part right there. I can close my eyes and I can see their faces. And many of their names are in the memorial wall. And in my last meeting with them, I did this. And one of them patted me on the knee. It might have been Agnes Elfing. And she said, "Tears are a sign of connection." She ministered to me. They all ministered to me. And they showed me, all of them offered me a window, offered this 25-year-old, 27-year-old a window into a profoundly rich life stage. And their ministry, their teachings continue to shape my life and ministry today. You were my teachers, and I found my ministry here, and which is why I asked you to ordain me when that time came. I keep using the word you, and so many of you sitting here were not members 20 years ago. Some of you might have been toddlers. But I say you because you are the Mount Diablo Unitarian Universalist Church. You are its past, you are its present, and you are the shape of its future. Our congregations, whether they're 60 years old or 400 years old, they are running streams that move through time, always moving, always changing, yet one body, always in service to something larger than ourselves. Reflecting on just your last 10 years, let alone 20, I'm so impressed, I'm so moved by all the ways that you, the lay members, and Leslie and David, create a spirit-growing, justice-making, compassion-deepening Unitarian Universalist congregation. There are so many things I could point to, but I don't want to embarrass you, so I'm just going to share a couple. 20 years ago, you could only help with the winter shelter off-site because you didn't have the facilities here to offer hospitality. And now you do. The Giving Orchard. What a brilliant combination of creativity, synergy, and pure beauty that will nourish both bodies and spirit. And more recently, your recommitment to building a strong and integrated lifespan religious education program and hiring a developmental director. 20 years ago, when I led the Coming of Age program, you trusted me with your children, and I had no idea what you were doing. And now that I'm a parent, I can say belatedly, but no less heartfelt, thank you. For I understand now in a very personal way how important the spiritual and moral development of our children and of our families is. And frankly, how hard it can be to find relevant quality programs that engage our children and families in the contemporary world as it is now. It is a vital need, and you are responding to it. Recently, a friend of mine confided in me with great surprise in her voice. I am 45 years old, Rachel, and I am still becoming. I had no idea I would still be becoming in my 40s. Life is always becoming. Like my friend Allison, no matter our age, until our last breath, our individual lives are always becoming. President Obama, during his remarks at the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery marches, said, "What greater form of patriotism is there than the belief that America is not yet finished, that we are strong enough to be self-critical, that each successive generation can look upon our imperfections and decide that it is in our power to remake this nation, to more closely align with our highest ideals. Our nation is always becoming, and our congregations are always becoming. They are laboratories for living, where we can practice holy curiosity. Like Barb's story this morning about how the journey across country is different with a friend, seeing the world differently, anew. So rooted in our covenant, we practice. We practice being our most grounded selves when we are afraid and in the wilderness. We practice speaking our experience of living under oppression and of living with privilege. And we bear witness to each other's stories, and we seek justice. And we stay connected through conflict, and we affirm love. And we forgive one another and ourselves, and we find hope. Our congregations are always becoming. This mountain that we sit at the foot of, that was sacred to so many tribal peoples who first lived here, is there a more powerful symbol of stability and solidity? And yet, that mountain continues to rise each year, 1/10 of an inch. It continues to rise. Life is always becoming. Our Unitarian Universalist faith proclaims this. Revelation is not sealed. Ours is a living tradition, responsive, hopeful, ever becoming. And our Unitarian Universalist congregations are our laboratories, seeking a just world, journeying through the wilderness to freedom together. Spirit of life that moves through all of creation, may this congregation trust evermore in the tensile strands of love that bend and stretch to hold us in the often torn but always healing web of life. In the shadow of this great mountain, amidst shifting plates, and on our journey of always becoming, may we find our strength there, in that love-woven web. May it be so. Amen.
Yeah.